Hey guys, Sean here. Today, Luke and I are back with another tier list. Today we'll be talking about the best meta decks for January 2025. We're coming to the end of the year now, and the meta has shaken up a lot, so there's a lot to talk about here. Let's talk about the best decks in the upcoming format. We have a few tiers here. We have
Maliss in Wonderland, Still Fire, Toss 2, Tenpai, and Fish Are Friends, Not Meta.
Let's get into it. Okay, we have a pretty cool one here. We have Fire King. Now, Fire King was hit indirectly on the ban list. The most popular build of Fire King, which was Snake Eye Fire King, got hit very badly with the banning of original Sinful Spoils. So, your Snake Eye engine cannot lead you into your Fire King engine anymore, which does hurt the deck a good bit. However, the deck is still topping with the Azumina cards specifically. So, it's still a meta-relevant deck, and it's definitely like the best Fire deck now. Fire Kings is genuinely the best Fire deck now, especially with cards like your Volcanics.
I definitely agree, yeah, so it's not going to be in the top tier with the others, but it's definitely deserves a spot in Still Fire. I still think it's going to be seeing a lot of play, especially because of that new bit of support with Volcanics, but also since people are adding different engines now, such as Fiendsmith and Azumina, I feel like you're still going to be seeing a lot of Fire King. There's still a lot to learn, a lot to play, definitely in the second tier.
Next up, a big casualty from the ban list, and I'm not complaining. We have Tenpai. Unfortunately, it got hit pretty badly, I will admit. Sangan Kaiman to 1 and your Chundra to 1. That is a big hit. That really hurts the consistency. However, I don't think the deck is dead. It's definitely still seeing play. It has topped at least once since the ban list. So it's definitely still a good deck. However, you know, it got hit pretty badly. I feel like this deck kind of might fizzle out. Ironically, the fact that people are not prepared for this deck anymore. People probably took out a lot of their really good cards for going up against Tenpai. It might make Tenpai a little bit better in some regards. People are not going to be as prepared for it, so if you're playing Tenpai, your opponent might just be blindsided by it and not really have a plan against it, which is kind of funny. But yeah, the deck got hit very badly. I don't think it's your best pick for the next format.
I definitely agree. They were definitely some really heavy hits on the ban list, especially Kaiman going down. That's one of the very big critical points of the deck. I still think you're still going to be seeing it played. I feel like it's going to be very similar to the likes of Tier, like when Tier got absolutely massacred in the ban list. The best Tier players still play Tier because they were good at playing it, so they're going to be finding a way to play it. I feel like the best Tenpai players are still going to be playing Tenpai, and there's some very good going second players that are just really good at going second decks. And considering that they're quite prevalent now, especially with the likes of Ancient Gears and Tenpai and stuff like that, there's definitely going to be a few surprises with going second deck. So Tenpai, I don't think it's completely dead, but it was hit very heavily, but still kind of lower in the tier. Definitely deserves its place in Tenpai.
Next up, the new king of the Yu-Gi-Oh meta, we have Ryzeal. Definitely one of the best decks this format. Arguably the best, but I think there is a bit of contention. I think Maliss does compare to Ryzeal in terms of how good it is. Ryzeal is just a really strong deck. It's really good into Max C in the OCG, so translating this to the TCG, very good against the Molcharmi cards. You can set up really good boards without summoning too much. The engine is small, so you're able to either pack the deck with a bunch of hand traps, or you can add consistency cards. There's a lot of different ways you can play the deck. Of course, pure Ryzeal is good, but Fiendsmith Ryzeal is most likely the best way to play the deck. It did win the most recent YCS by the legend Triff himself. Most people agree that the Fiendsmith engine is just way too good not to include in Ryzeal, but it is definitely playable without it. Duo Drive is just an insane card. Detonator as well, insanely good, not once per turn, can pop a bunch of cards in the field, even when it's negated. If you get your aggregator attached to this card, even if it's negated, you can still detach it for cost and negate your opponent's cards, which is just a little bit insane. It's just such a good deck. Another funny thing about Ryzeal being such a good deck is that cards like Dimension Barrier are going to be pretty much side deck staples, and that really hurts decks like Tenpai. So decks that really suffer against Dimension Barrier kind of just catch astray by how good Ryzeal is. And of course, cards like Zeus, Typhon, really good XZs for your deck. So probably the best deck in the upcoming format.
You can always tell a deck is really good because a lot of people were playing it in the last YCS in Anaheim, and considering that the deck was barely even 2 or 3 weeks old and it was still seeing a lot of play during that tournament, really speaks volumes how powerful the deck is. What I really like about it is that it kind of has a simple sort of format to it, in the sense that you're basically spamming out a bunch of rank 4s, and a lot of people just love like rank 4 builds. But what's something that people don't really mention a lot is the fact that there are some very powerful rank 4 monsters that can just be generic that you can chuck into this deck. What I seen a lot during the YCS was that a lot of people were playing Abyss Dweller, and Abyss Dweller can be quite crippling to a few decks as well. So Ryzeal has a good matchup against a lot of other decks, but also there's a lot of other generic rank 4 monsters that people haven't really been experimenting with recently, and I think that they'll probably be chucking it into this deck in the coming format. And considering that the deck is already seeing a lot of play and it's still fairly new, I think this is going to be something we're going to be seeing quite a lot of.
The only deck that can really compete is Maliss. I do think Ryzeal is better. Time will tell, I guess. But Maliss is still a very, very good deck. Again, saw a ton of play at YCS Anaheim. Pretty much imagine all your favorite things about Matmech, but in a good deck. This deck is really, really good. It's a Cyberse deck, so it can make use of a lot of really good Cyberse support, a lot of really good extra deck Cyberse cards. Ending on your Link 5 Firewall Terahertz is just insanely good. Being able to dump that fusion card from your extra deck to the grave, so you have an Omni Negate, is just insanely strong. Boosting itself up as well. Most of the cards banish for cost, so they're really hard to interact with. Their traps can be activated during the turn they're set if you banish a card, which is just really good because it gives you advantage while being able to activate traps. Really good combo deck. It really does hold its own against Ryzeal. They're both fantastic decks. But of course, being one of the best decks, there are going to be people side decking or even maining Artifact Lancia, which is a huge counter to this deck. Of course, it doesn't completely kill the deck, but it is a big hit if you get Lancias playing Maliss. Your chances of winning do go down by a lot, but of course every deck has its counters. Maliss is still a fantastic deck, and I do think it's going to see a ton of play in the upcoming format.
So Maliss and Ryzeal are definitely going to be the top 2 decks. One thing I think though is that they are very different. I think Maliss kind of relies more on links, whereas Ryzeal kind of relies more on XZs. But the thing about Maliss is the fact that it's going to be way harder to interact with than the likes of Ryzeal, just because cards that banish for cost make it very, very difficult for you to kind of interact with that kind of stuff. With the likes of negation and stuff like that, a lot of negation is targeted, but if you're banishing your cards for cost in order to get the effect to go through, it can be really, really hard to interact with. I think that Maliss is going to be very, very good, but I think it's going to take a unique kind of player to really master the deck. I think that Ryzeal has like a lower barrier to entry in terms of learning it, but Maliss will be a little bit trickier as you kind of go along, especially when it comes to how you treat your resources. Considering that a lot of stuff is banishing for cost, you still need to kind of keep track of what you're banishing and what needs to be recycled and stuff like that. So I think Maliss is going to be very, very good, but only the best players will be able to play it efficiently.
And let's not forget, it's a banished deck. You can play cards like Shifter. Not all builds are going to play it, but it's definitely an option. Shifter is an insane card, and it really isn't affected by Dimensional Barrier, which is going to be a really common card in this format, so it does get points for those 2 things right there. Next up, Voiceless Voice. I'm not sure if we should put it like directly mid or maybe a little bit up. It's a very good deck, especially with the Mulcharmies. You can really set up like a really good board by only giving your opponent like 1 or 2 draws. It's fantastic in that respect. It can run Dominus Purge, which is not a bad card, not as good as Dominus Impulse, but it is still a card the deck can run. You're mainly running light monsters, so it is pretty good for the deck. Because Voiceless Voice has never been a bad deck, it's always been a good deck. It's just been outshined by a lot of other really good decks, like Pure Snake Guy being insanely strong, Yubel being insanely strong as well, only a few months after Voiceless came out. But I think it's a really good mid-range deck. You can play it a lot of different ways as well. You can play it with some branded stuff, you can play it like a Dogmatica version. It's just a really good deck. I think people sleep on it. I think it's really good, especially into like Mulcharmies and stuff like that. I think it's really good. I think it really does hold its own against the meta decks.
I think it deserves a spot in Still Fire, just because it was never really a bad deck. It's still going to be as good as it was before. It hasn't got hit on the ban list at all, pretty much went unscathed, which is kind of deservedly, because I don't think it's going to be the best deck in the format. I still think Fire King and of course Ryzeal and Maliss are going to be a lot better, but Voiceless Voice still can hold its own. And again, as you mentioned, considering that it's able to set up a pretty decent board even under Mulcharmy, can be really a strong argument to say that Voiceless Voice is going to be one of the top contenders for the deck. I don't think it's going to be as good as some of the other decks, but definitely still on the lower end of Still Fire.
Next up, Orcust. We are back in 2019. Let's go. Orcust is a really cool deck. With the recent unbans of stuff like your Harp Horror and stuff like that, it is genuinely a playable deck. especially in combination with like the Horus engine and stuff like that. It's a fan favorite deck. People are going to play it, and people are going to win with it. It's a really cool deck. It can still do everything it could do back in 2019, and even more now with engines like Horus and stuff like that. It's a really fun deck, and it's really cool, and your opponent might not be expecting it because it is a 2019 deck. It's been a while. People either might not know what the deck does at all, or might have forgotten by now. It can catch your opponent off guard, and it is getting new support at some point soon enough, so that will really help the deck. I really do hope I see it more, but you know, it is not the best deck in the game, but I think it's pretty cool.
I definitely agree. Orcust is, of course, we're going back to 2019. There's going to be a good few TOS deck representation in this format. Orcust I find to be really good, and considering that it's going to be getting a bit of support, hopefully earlier in the year rather than later. With the addition of that Link 1, I think this deck is going to open up to a whole new realm of possibilities. What the old Orcust decks were kind of doing was basically kind of a link climbing strategy, that you're using some monsters that you link off, then in the graveyard you can kind of use their effects to splash some more monsters out and then link climb your way up. I think this is very, very good, and considering that it's going hand in hand with your likes of the Horus engine, and considering that Horus is very much lenient on filling up your graveyard with monsters, and then you can use those as Xyz material for the likes of your zombie vampire. Use zombie vampire to mill your deck a little bit, and then maybe you can open access to some of your Orcust plays. I think they just go hand in hand really, really well. I actually was looking at a build I kind of more lean towards, that I kind of like, is that a 60 card build with Horus and Orcust. I just think it's a really, really good kind of like mill strategy, and who doesn't love mill decks? I think it'll be really, really cool. Definitely something to check out. I think it's definitely going to be kind of like in the middle of the table. I say it will get some good representation. We really don't know how good this deck is going to be until we get that new wave of support, but for the time being, I think it's going to be a bit of fun. So kind of like middle of the table, we're pretty much going into TOS 2.
Next up, Fiendsmith. I'm very tempted to put this deck in the top tier.
I wouldn't argue.
It's really, really good. Fiendsmith is just insane, not only as an engine, but as a pure deck. We recently saw Kashtira Fiendsmith be a very popular deck, very strong deck as well, and now pure Fiendsmith is seeing a lot of play as a very, very strong deck. It's just insanely good. All your cards do so many things. It has insane grind game. It's just really hard for your opponent to play into. It can run a bunch of hand traps, as we saw, with some lists running like 23 hand traps, which is kind of insane. And of course, in the new format, that can be board breakers and tech cards and everything. Just having that much room for non-engine is just absolutely crazy. The Kashtira build might suffer a little bit with Maliss being so popular, because of course people will be playing Lancia, so that might hurt the deck a little bit. But pure Fiendsmith is looking very, very strong. Wasn't hit on the newest ban list. Really, really good with like the magical musket engine. Just a fantastic kind of set of light fiend monsters that work really well with the deck. Pure builds can even run a bunch of like really good rank 6s as well, like your Volzar Lars and your DDD King Caesar. So the deck has so much flexibility. It's just a really, really good deck. So I'm very convinced that it is pretty much as good as Ryzeal and Maliss.
I definitely agree. I think Fiendsmith's the new Snake Eyes, in the sense that when Fire King was kind of getting big, people were saying, oh, Snake Eyes is going to be the engine to make Fire King a lot better. I think Fiendsmith's kind of going down the same way, in the way that when Snake Eye was topping and Fiendsmith was getting introduced, people were thinking, oh, Fiendsmith's going to be a good engine to make Snake Eye a lot better. But Fiendsmith's kind of taken on a life of its own, where not only is it a very good engine in other decks, but it can actually be used as your main engine, and then you can use other external sort of things, like your Magical Musket or even your Kashtira. I really think that Fiendsmith is not one to be underlooked. It's going to be one hell of a deck. And not only that, it can also play through a lot of hand traps as well. Very similar to how Snake Eye can play through a lot of different things. Fiendsmith decks can pretty much do the exact same thing. They can bait out a bunch of hand traps with the one engine and then switch out their next engine to continue on their plays unscathed. So Fiendsmith is definitely going to be up there as a very high contender. It's definitely one to be looking out for going into the next meta.
Next up we have Mermails. As much as I want to put them in the bottom tier, they're not that bad. They're better than Tenpai. So Mermail got a lot of new support in Rage of the Abyss, pretty much tying Mermail and Atlantean together, so you can pretty much run the two archetypes as one deck, which is really, really cool. The deck mainly focuses on spamming the board. You can discard a bunch of your water monsters to special summon stuff, spam the board and go into some really powerful links and Xyz. Really consistent deck. It's very good at what it does. However, there's a lack of like a really good boss monster. The deck does struggle to make some like crazy boards. It can make decent boards and it's very consistent at doing so, but it's nothing crazy. It's like okay. Tenpai might just be better. I think it's like okay. We'll put it down here. Why not? It fits the tier. It's an okay deck. It's not bad. It does top events. It's a fan favorite, of course. A lot of people play it. A lot of people love it. But it's nothing crazy. It doesn't have any edge against the meta decks. It can't do anything particularly well against the best decks in the game. It's okay.
Yeah, I kind of think we're in an unfortunate circumstance for Mermails right now because they don't really have a clear edge over any of the other decks that we're talking about. Not to say that Mermails aren't a good deck, they can still do a lot of stuff, but what they can mainly do is sort of spam the board and go for sort of like Xyz plays and stuff like that. But even saying that, their Xyz monster are vastly overshadowed by the Xyz monster of the Ryzeal monsters. So it's kind of hard to say like they're not even the best Xyz deck in this format, they're far from it. It's kind of unfortunate. I feel like maybe there would be a bit more kickback and we would have gotten a bit better support with what we got with Rage the Abyss, because I kind of want to see us get out of this fire format now, and I would have rather seen us get out of it with a very good water deck rather than a banless massacre, if you get me. I think Mermails can do some good stuff. It's just that, as you say, they kind of lack a very clear boss monster. They do have some big boys that can like do some stuff, but as far as I'm concerned, it's just not in the best position right now. It's still fun to talk about as its fan favorites, but I just don't think it's right there right now. Maybe in another few formats or so.
Next up, Labrynth, the deck that never dies. I think it's about here. It is, I don't want to call it mid because it's very good. It's definitely a very good deck. You can play it a lot of different ways. You can really tailor your trap lineup to pretty much like whatever matchup you want. It can play Dominance Impulse, which is just first of all a fantastic trap, but also a fantastic hand trap, so makes really good use of that card. Plays really well into Molcharmies, the Furniture version is really good, the Equation Cannon version is insanely good. Wasn't touched by the ban list, we still have access to all our broken traps, can run a bunch of Floodgates, can run really specific cards for certain matchups. The Daruma Cannon is always an insanely good card. It just has so many different ways you can play it. It can pretty much win any matchup if you build it correctly. It doesn't really care about board breakers either. A lot of your traps can just be activated whenever you want. It might be a bit worse now considering Tenpai is not as good. It was really good against Tenpai. That was one of the main reasons you would run it. Now that Tenpai is pretty much dead, it's still a good deck 100% and it still has decent matchups into the best decks. However, I feel like the decks above it just have the edge. Again, not a bad deck at all, but it is just not as good as the decks above it.
Yeah, there's still some great Labrynth players out there, and look, it can still play Eradicator, Epidemic Virus, and goddamn, that card has ruined me on so many occasions. I just know Labrynth is going to find ways to pull out all the different stops to kind of contend with the top decks. It's still going to be a very, very powerful force.
Next up, Evil Hero, which is going to get new support in Supreme Darkness in late January. So of course this is coming out late January, so it won't have too much of an impact on the format. But when it comes out, how will it do? It's going to be the best deck in the game. Now, we're going to put it like maybe, I think Tenpai's still better, but like...
Yeah, I'd probably put it just below Tenpai. It has some interesting cards, but I think the good cards and the Evil Hero stuff is going to be added to Omni Heroes. But Omni Heroes are still always going to be rogue no matter what. I just don't think the Evil Hero stuff is as good as just playing like regular Omni Hero. So we're going to be talking about Evil Hero just because it's kind of like new to the format and it's going to be like kind of the face of the format a little bit when that new set comes out. But yeah, probably on the lower spectrum of the actual format itself.
Next up, Centur-Ion's a fan favorite deck. I think this is tough to say now because it's not bad at all, but where does it really fit in the format? Definitely not a bad deck. It had a great matchup in the Tenpai. The boards were very hard to break. Really good against the Molcharmy cards as well. You don't really have to give your opponent that many draws. I really like the deck. I think it's just a really cool deck, a really fun playstyle. But it does suffer in a few areas. Of course, Dimension Barrier, going to be very popular. And it really hurts the deck because you're running pretty much only Synchro monsters. Its matchups against the best decks are not the best. It has pretty good grind game, but I don't think it's as good as decks like Fiendsmith or even Labrynth. Of course, it's not bad and it's fairly budget in terms of Yu-Gi-Oh decks, so it will see a lot of play, but I don't know if it's much better than Labrynth. It can still do everything it did before, wasn't hit on the ban list. It's still a great deck. The new support it got as well makes it really, really good. but I'm not sure how well it's going to do in this format. Not a bad deck at all, but I just think it's not as good as the decks above it.
I would still move it up just one. I think Labrynth in comparison doesn't make as good of boards as Centur-Ion. When Centur-Ion is really able to like kick off, they can build like really impossible boards to like really break down. So I still think it's going to be really good. It's going to be harder for them to pop off with the rise of the Mulcharmy cards, so they can either build a really great board that's hard to break, or they kind of play into their opponent's sort of max C. But I still think the boards that they do make are still really impressive, so I'd give them the edge over Labrynth just a smidge bit, so I think it definitely deserves to be at the top of Toss 2.
Next up, Yubel. Yubel is back, maybe about here.
That's exactly where I would have put it. Yeah, definitely in the middle of Stillfire. Yubel got slightly hit, but then slightly unhit in the ban list, so opening the Spirit Gates came back to 3, which doesn't really matter too much, but Phantom Yubel went to 1. So Phantom honestly is a very powerful card. I think it should have been at 1 anyways. But what I really like about Yubel is with a bunch of decks such as Fire King that destroy your monsters and stuff like that, Yubel doesn't really suffer because Yubel has some very good recycling effects that they're able to just bring themselves out over and over again. Like Spirit can bring out Yubel, Yubel can bring out Terror Incarnate, Terror Incarnate can bring out Ultimate Nightmare. If you play it, it's still really good at recycling itself, and in the grind game, I think it's going to be really good and really powerful. What I think is really good about Yubel and why it's going to be like a high rogue deck and still kind of like in the second tier is the fact that you can play it on its own or you can play with the Unchained stuff, and they're both still really high contenders. Honestly, it makes sense to play with the Unchained stuff because that leads you to more interruption and more ways that you can actually like kind of win out games by life point damage. But even still, considering that a lot of like the top decks are running monsters that are like very big and very heavy, if you were able to have Nightmare Pain in the field and then your opponent is attacking in, you can use Spirit Yubel to special itself out, and then that can leave your opponent in a very tricky situation. I think Yubel is going to be very good this format. I don't think it's going to be as good as Fire King or any of the other top decks, but I still think it's going to do fairly well.
Next up, Sky Strikers. We're really back in Toss format. Sky Strikers, of course, fan favorite deck. Everyone loves it. Always a pretty good rogue deck. Of course, last format we saw people playing builds with like over 30 spell cards in the deck, which was absolutely crazy. It was great to see decks that had like 3 main deck monsters and a bunch of spells, and it saw a lot of success. As a going second like board breaker deck, it was really good. And you're even seeing people play Maliss Sky Striker, which is a really cool way to play Maliss and to play Sky Strikers. It's just really cool. But of course, it is pretty much the definition of a rogue deck. It's a very good and popular rogue deck, but it is still the definition of a rogue deck.
I definitely agree. Sky Striker is always going to be rogue no matter what. The fact that Tenpai has got hit heavily, you can make an argument that Sky Strikers can be a better going second deck than Tenpai is now, just considering that it would be a bit more consistent now. And as you mentioned earlier, of course, there's a lot of Sky Striker builds that are running like a bunch of spells just to get their spell card secondary effects as quickly as possible, which of course really good. Sky Strikers, I feel you're just never going to get rid of them. They're a fan favorite, definitely belongs in the middle of Toss 2.
And finally we have Ritual Beast, probably like the best deck in the mid tier. It can run Shifter, so that's a great point in its favor. It can Protoss Lock, it can summon Thunder Dragon Colossus. None of this has changed. It could always do this, and it still can. It wasn't touched by the ban list. A really good deck, a really good combo deck. Very difficult to play, but also very difficult to play against. It can just do so much. A lot of the cards just being not once per turn is insane. It does suffer a bit with the Mulcharmies, specifically Perulia, because you do a lot of normal summoning in this deck, and Perulia does give you a draw if you normal summon, so that can be a bit of an issue. And you do special summon a lot from the deck and extra deck, so again, Fuvalos is a really tough card to play around. And you really focus on banishing, so cards like Lancia really hurt the deck. And in me saying all this, I do think it belongs a bit lower. It's good, it can do a lot, but the format I don't think is the best for Ritual Beast. A lot of the stuff that counters the best decks counter this, and it really just gets caught in the crossfire.
I definitely agree. I definitely think that there are some really good Ritual Beast players out there, but it's just that the deck itself is going to be overshadowed by a lot of really powerful decks. It will still have its fans, it will still be seen in tournaments and stuff like that, but yeah, just mightn't be the best one out there. Definitely kind of in the middle of the list where it belongs.
Alright, so that's it for the tier list of the best meta decks for January 2025. Let us know what you think in the comments. Do you agree or disagree? Let us know. Do you think we placed a deck too high or too low? We'd love to know your opinion. The next format's going to be really interesting and we're very excited to see how it goes. So thanks for watching. Let us know what you think in the comments. If you want to support the channel, we do have memberships. So if you want to see our content early, consider becoming a member. And if you want to build any of these decks in real life, we do have a TCG Player affiliate link in the description, which you can check out. If you buy cards using that link, it directly supports the channel and helps us keep up making content. So thanks for watching and stay tuned for more tier lists.